Usually when we talk about like a magical transformation, there's this whole expectation of a fairy tale.
Right, the classic Cinderella story.
Exactly. A wave of a wand, a pumpkin turns into a carriage, a penniless flower girl magically transforms into a duchess, and they all live happily ever after.
It's neat. It's very comforting.
It is. It's a formula we are practically hardwired to expect because, well, we want the romance, we want that clean resolution.
Yeah, but then you step into the world of George Bernard Shaw, and suddenly that magic wand is just broken over his knee.
Totally shattered.
Right. We're looking at a landscape of social mobility, class warfare, and this is the weird part, linguistic science, that is completely uncompromising.
I mean, it is the absolute definition of a structural and ideological subversion of everything the audience thinks they want.
It really is. Shaw takes that comforting formula and just weaponizes it, to force us to look at the uncomfortable realities of class and human nature.
So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are asking a massive question for you. What does it take to truly transform a person's identity in society?
And how did a story about that exact premise completely change the landscape of modern theater?
Right. Because if you are prepping for an exam, or if you're just insanely curious about the history of literature and how we got the stories we have today, this is for you. We are diving into a huge stack of academic texts that cover the evolution of English drama from 1660 all the way to the 20th century.
It's a massive timeline.
It really is. We're going to explore the fascinating, highly unconventional mind of George Bernard Shaw himself, and then we're going to do a microscopic breakdown of his masterpiece, Pygmalion.
And our goal today is to really connect the dots here. We aren't just going to memorize historical facts or list off a bunch of plays.
No, nobody wants that.
Right. We are going to understand the underlying mechanisms, the why behind them. Why did theater evolve the way it did across centuries? And why were Shaw's ideas so revolutionary when they finally hit the stage?
So if Shaw is going to completely subvert the theater of his time, we have to first understand the theatrical world he inherited, right? The one he broke down and rebuilt.
Exactly. We have to set the stage.
Let's rewind the clock to a very specific year, 1660, the Restoration period. What exactly is happening in England that makes this such a hard reset for drama?
Well, 1660 is a pivotal year because it marks the end of a very long, very dark period for English drama. The English theaters had actually been shut down completely since 1642.
Wait, completely shut down?
Yeah, completely, due to Puritan repression. For 18 years, acting was essentially illegal.
Wow.
So when King Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, the reopening of the theaters marked a decisive, almost explosive break with the past. But they didn't just pick up where Shakespeare left off.
Right, because things had changed culturally.
Exactly. Charles II had been in exile in France, and he brought all these French tastes back with him. Suddenly, the dominant influence came from French playwrights like Pierre Corneille and Jean Racine.
Who were doing, very grand tragedy, right?
Yes, highly structured tragedy. And Molière, who had achieved unrivaled success in comedy over in France.
The physical spaces changed completely, too, didn't they? I mean, I'm picturing the Elizabethan theater like Shakespeare's Globe.
Right, the classic wooden O.
Yeah. It's open air, lit by the afternoon sun, and essentially bare stage where the audience is standing in the pit, literally right up against the actors.
Very rowdy, very exposed.
But in the Restoration, that entire architecture is just tossed out.
Entirely. We move into enclosed spaces. Picture these long, narrow auditoriums. For the first time, we have artificial lights, mostly candles, which changes the entire mood.
Oh, I bet. You can actually control the lighting.
Exactly. It allows for different times of day to be portrayed more effectively.
Yeah.
We also see the introduction of actual painted sets and the rudiments of stage properties. The visual spectacle becomes a massive part of the experience.
And crucially, this is when women finally invade the English stage as actresses.
Yes, a huge milestone.
Because for decades prior, you had teenage boys playing female roles. You no longer needed someone to, as Shakespeare famously put it, buoy Cleopatra's greatness.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Women didn't have to be given male disguises just to make the casting work, like you see in As You Like It or Twelfth Night.
Right, you could actually just cast a woman.
Plays with dominant, complex female roles could finally be written with the knowledge that actual women would be performing them, which brought a completely new dynamic to the stage, especially in, romantic and comedic scenes.
And it wasn't just the physical theater that changed, right?
Yeah.
The entire intellectual mindset of the era shifted.
Oh, absolutely.
The first 25 years of the Restoration, during the reign of Charles II, were totally marked by this spirit of reason, empiricism, and, frankly, extreme social license.
They were throwing off the Puritan restrictions.
Yeah. You have the influence of Francis Bacon's inductive method, telling people to trust what they can observe. You have the revolutionary astronomy of Copernicus and Galileo, proving the Earth isn't the center of the universe.
And philosophically, you have Thomas Hobbes and his anti-idealistic political theory in Leviathan.
Which is pretty bleak, right?
It is. Hobbes argued that human beings are fundamentally driven by self-interest and a desire for power. If you connect this to the broader cultural picture, this new age was actively dispensing with faith, mystery, and old intellectual authority.
They completely mistrusted the supernatural.
Right. The imagination was denigrated in favor of cold, hard facts. They threw out the old ethics and called for a highly practical, pragmatic value system. It was an era that openly ridiculed notions of chastity, marital fidelity, and romantic idealism.
Which perfectly explains the genres that dominated the time. You have heroic tragedy and the comedy of manners. Let's talk about heroic tragedy first, because it sounds almost entirely French in its DNA.
It is heavily inspired by the French neoclassicists. Writers like John Dryden, Nathaniel Lee, and Thomas Otway were writing these grand, sweeping plays.
And they were super strict about structure.
Right. Very strict. They observed the classical unities of time, place, and action, meaning the play had to take place over a single day in a single location following one main plot.
No jumping around in time or space.
Exactly. And they featured grand characters, emperors, kings, generals who were larger than life with exaggerated emotions and these huge bombastic speeches.
The central theme always seems to be this massive clash between honor and passion.
Yes, always. Dryden even adapted Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra into a play called All for Love. But to fit the new tastes, he restricted the sprawling, multi-country epic of Shakespeare into a tight, unified structure.
So he just condensed the whole thing.
He did, and he used blank verse, though he had used highly structured rhymed couplets in his other heroic plays like The Conquest of Granada. It was all very formal, very rigid.
But the real star of the era, the genre that actually survived and influenced writers like Shaw later on, was the comedy of manners.
Oh, it was wildly popular.
You have playwrights like George Etheridge, William Wycherley, and William Congreve. Congreve gave us absolute classics like The Way of the World. These plays were written primarily by and for the urban upper class of London.
And their great model was Molière. What Molière did in France was build plays around central eccentric characters, a miser, a misanthrope, a religious hypocrite, but he used those characters to launch probing social criticism.
And the English took that and just ran with it.
The English comedy of manners took that blueprint and provided a razor-sharp critique of the manners, affectations, and morals of contemporary high society, using complex disguises, bedroom intrigues, and farcical action.
The character archetypes are so specific and funny. Let me make sure I have this right. It's basically a 17th century high school drama.
That's a pretty good way to look at it.
You got the gallants and belles, the cool kids from the London aristocracy. Then you have the witwoods, who are the tryhards, the people who desperately want to be witty but just come off as annoying.
Yep, the wannabes.
You have fops, who are obsessed with fashion, the country cousins, who are the awkward kids from out of town, and jealous middle-class tradesmen.
That is a perfect analogy. The plots were almost entirely about intrigues and seductions, and the dialogue was the main attraction. It was incredibly witty, polished repartee. It was literal verbal fencing.
But what fascinates me is the morality of these comedies, because conventional morality was just completely jettisoned. If a husband gets cheated on, he's the punchline, not the victim.
That is the core mechanism of the comedy of manners. The target of the satire was the ridiculed cuckold, the foolish husband who couldn't keep his wife's attention, not the unscrupulous seducer.
So the bad guy is actually the hero.
If you were clever and stylish, you were the hero, regardless of how immoral your actions were by traditional standards. The successful lover was an urbane aristocrat with wit, grace, tact, and shrewdness.
So it's this freewheeling, cynical, very witty era, but it doesn't last. We hit the 18th century, and there's a huge sudden decline in English theater. Why does a genre that successful just vanish?
The decline is tied directly to political and social shifts. It starts after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which overthrew the Catholic King James II and brought in the Protestant King William.
Okay, so a big regime change.
A massive one. This revolution was conceptually guided by John Locke's idea of governance as a social contract. The Whig Party came to dominate Georgian England, and political and economic power heavily shifted away from the aristocracy and toward middle-class shopkeepers, traders, and merchants.
And I'm guessing those middle-class merchants didn't appreciate paying for theater tickets just to watch aristocrats make fun of them and sleep with their wives on stage.
Exactly. With that middle-class orientation, the tolerance for those immoral comedies vanished. You had a resurgent clergy, too.
Right, there was that one specific essay, wasn't there?
Yes. In 1698, a bishop named Jeremy Collier wrote a famous, blistering tract attacking the profaneness and immorality of the English stage. He systematically went after playwrights for rewarding vice and mocking virtue.
It's wild that a single essay by a clergyman could basically kill a genre, but it worked. The sources say that tract virtually ended Congreve's career and put the nail in the coffin of Restoration comedy.
The resulting shift was towards sentimental drama, championed by writers like Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. The plays became morally simpler, much narrower, and highly didactic.
So they were basically preaching to the audience.
Very much so. Romantic love, which had been treated as a cynical joke in the Restoration, was suddenly extolled and glorified. The characters became these weeping models of virtue.
It sounds kind of boring, to be honest. Were there any bright spots in the 18th century?
A few, mostly when writers actively rebelled against that sentimentality. John Gay wrote The Beggar's Opera in 1728, which was an immensely popular musical satirizing the government by comparing politicians to the criminal underworld of thieves and prostitutes.
Oh, that sounds actually fun.
It was. And Henry Fielding wrote brilliant parodies like Tom Thumb, but his political attacks on the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, resulted in the Licensing Act of 1737.
Which was a censorship law, right?
Yes. This act established strict theatrical censorship, which effectively ruined Fielding's dramatic career and drove him to write novels instead.
Wow.
Later in the century, you had Oliver Goldsmith with She Stoops to Conquer and Richard Brinsley Sheridan with The School for Scandal. These returned to the witty comedy of manners format, but they had to keep the morality much cleaner.
So it's a pretty barren phase overall, which takes us into the 19th century. From roughly 1790 to 1890, we have the Romantic and Victorian periods. And this is where the history gets really strange.
It does.
Because while Germany and France were crushing it theatrically, England was failing miserably on stage.
It is a stark contrast. In Germany, you had giants like Goethe writing Faust, and Schiller writing masterpieces like William Tell and The Robbers. These plays featured larger-than-life rebels struggling against oppressive authority.
And France was doing well too, right?
Yes, in France, Victor Hugo wrote great romantic plays like Hernani. The continent was vibrant.
But in England, the great romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, they all tried writing plays, and they all fundamentally failed as playwrights. Why? I mean, these are some of the greatest writers in the English language.
It comes down to a misunderstanding of the medium. The sources mention Percy Bysshe Shelley's The Cenci and Lord Byron's Manfred as perhaps the best of a bad bunch.
Which isn't saying much.
No, it's not. The problem was that these poets were too focused on grand, solitary rebels and lofty poetic dialogue. They wrote what we call closet dramas.
Closet dramas.
Plays better suited for reading in a private room than performing on a stage. When you put actors on a physical stage, they need actions to perform, subtext to play, and dialogue that sounds plausible when spoken between two moving bodies.
And the poets just weren't doing that.
No. The Romantics wrote beautiful verse, but it was completely separated from contemporary reality and lacked basic dramatic mechanics.
And then, as we move deeper into the Victorian period, the popular theater just devolves into melodrama. It sounds like watching a terrible daytime soap opera. You know, you have totally black and white characters, the pure maiden, the mustache-twirling villain, sensational last-minute rescues.
Only divorced from how real life operates.
Right. Or, on the flip side, you had the French well-made play by writers like Eugene Scribe and Victorien Sardou.
Yes, those were incredibly popular, but entirely artificial.
So.
They were highly contrived puzzles, full of intercepted letters, mistaken identities, and central misunderstandings that could be cleared up with one honest conversation, but instead are dragged out for 3 acts.
So English theater is stagnant. It's either boring poetry, cheap melodrama, or artificial puzzles. To finally break out of this, the true revolution had to come from Europe again, specifically from Norway with Henrik Ibsen.
Ibsen is the guy who ushered in realistic drama.
And his dominant concern was the middle class, which by the late 19th century completely dominated the period politically and economically.
Yes, Ibsen aimed for something called verisimilitude, the absolute illusion of reality. In his major plays from the late 1870s onward, plays like A Doll's House, Ghosts, The Wild Duck, Hedda Gabler. He believed in objective reality on stage.
He wanted it to feel like real life.
He wanted characters who resembled real people, experiencing things that could actually take place in the real world of his audience.
Wait, before we move on, what does verisimilitude actually mean in a practical sense for a playwright? Because the mechanics of how he pulled this off are fascinating. He actually went back to the old Greek unities of time, place, and action, right?
He did, but he adapted them for realism. Unity of time means the entire plot of the play unfolds over a very short period, usually 24 to 48 hours.
Okay, very compressed.
Unity of place means it happens in one location, like a single living room. And unity of action means there's one central plot, no sprawling subplots.
But if the whole play only covers 24 hours in one living room, how do you explain the backstory to the audience without it sounding like clunky exposition, like, as you know, Bob, 10 years ago?
That is where Ibsen's genius comes in. He popularized the late point of attack. Because the play starts very close to the climax of the story, Ibsen had to find a natural way to reveal the past.
So what did he do?
He would often use the device of a visitor arriving, someone who hasn't been around for years. Take a doll's house. An old friend of Nora's, Mrs. Lind, comes to town. As Nora catches her friend up on her life, she naturally reveals the deep, dark secret she's been hiding, and the audience gets the exposition organically.
Oh, that's smart. It's structured almost like a modern thriller. The past constantly haunts the present.
Exactly. He also completely revolutionized the sensory experience of the theater. His characters spoke in prose, deliberately trying to sound like real people, not poets.
And the sets were super detailed, right?
Photographic in their detail. He put actual functioning lamps on stage to indicate the source of illumination, which allowed him to build rich symbolic patterns of light and darkness.
And the acting style changed entirely, too.
Yeah.
Under Ibsen's realism, the actors were instructed to completely ignore the audience.
Right, the fourth wall.
The stage and the auditorium were treated as watertight compartments separated by this invisible fourth wall. The premise was that the actor wasn't acting at all. They were simply leading a real life, and the audience happened to be eavesdropping.
So Ibsen perfects this tight psychological realism, but then the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov comes along a few years later and actually modifies Ibsen's realism.
He thought Ibsen was doing it wrong.
Chekhov felt Ibsen was still a bit too sensational, that there were too many suicides, forged documents, and violent deaths that were, to use Aristotle's terms, possible but not entirely probable for everyday people. Chekhov moved from the drama of indirect action to the drama of inaction.
That's a crucial distinction. Ibsen's realism was highly structured, psychological intensity focused on a single driving action over a short time. But Chekhov rejected the unity of time. He argued that forcing a lifetime of dramatic events into a single 24-hour span didn't convey genuine reality.
I have to push back here for a second, though. If Ibsen created the perfect illusion of reality with his unities and his perfectly timed reveals, why did Chekhov feel the need to break Ibsen's rules to be more real?
Because real life isn't a neat, perfectly timed puzzle. Real life is messy. In a Chekhov play like The Cherry Orchard or Three Sisters, months or years might pass between acts. And more importantly, he changed how characters converse.
Right. Chekhov's characters they're messier in how they communicate.
Exactly. Think about a real conversation at a family gathering. People don't wait patiently for one person to finish a perfectly structured monologue and then respond directly to the premise.
No, people interrupt. They get distracted.
In Chekhov's plays, characters often don't listen to each other. One person might be pouring their heart out about a lost love, and the other person responds by complaining that their shoes are too tight.
That is so true to life.
They change the topic abruptly. They talk past one another. By doing this, Chekhov aimed at the depiction of a broader social panorama rather than Ibsen's intense psychological thriller action. He captured a specific, mundane psychological truth, the isolation of the individual that Ibsen's tighter plots missed.
Okay, so this is the theatrical landscape as we reach the turn of the 20th century. We have a stage dominated by middle-class realism, tight Ibsen plots, messy Chekhovian psychology, and in England, you have Oscar Wilde warming things up with his sparkling, witty comedies like The Importance of Being Earnest.
Right. And into this very specific world steps a man with a completely unique, often contradictory set of ideologies, George Bernard Shaw. Let's unpack the mind of Shaw.
Before we delve into Shaw's ideological background, it is essential to establish some context for you listening. The academic sources detail Shaw's heavily left-wing political ideologies, as well as his specific social and philosophical leanings.
Yeah, we have to be clear about this.
We are examining these strictly as historical facts to understand the mechanics of his art and the context of his plays. We are analyzing the source material impartially without endorsing or taking sides on any of the political viewpoints presented.
Absolutely. Our mission here is just to figure out what made this guy tick so we can understand his writing. So, politically, Shaw's awakening came when he wrote Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty, which converted him to leftist causes in economics.
And from there, he got deeply involved with the Fabian Society, working alongside thinkers like William Morris and Sidney and Beatrice Webb.
The Fabians were distinct from other socialist movements of the time, weren't they?
They were because they advocated for gradual constitutional, social, and economic reforms within a democratic framework rather than violent revolution. Shaw became one of their most prominent pamphleteers and speakers.
He was also heavily influenced by Ibsen's concept of the new woman, which you see in characters like Nora in A Doll's House.
Right. Shaw viewed women not as delicate Victorian flowers, but as active, dynamic fighters for their rights, emerging as an early advocate for what we would now call feminism.
But here is where Shaw diverges from standard political reformers. He soon realized that passing laws and changing institutions just wasn't enough. He believed that human nature itself had to evolve if society was going to survive.
He went deep into evolutionary theory.
Yeah, he didn't just buy into Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, the blind survival of the fittest. Shaw wanted to go beyond Darwin to a philosophy where evolution could be willed into existence.
He formulated a philosophy he called creative evolution, driven by what he termed the life force. To build this, he drew on the evolutionary theories of Lamarck, who believed acquired traits could be inherited.
And Samuel Butler, too, right?
Yes, Butler, who criticized Darwin for having banished mind from the universe. He incorporated Henri Bergson's book Creative Evolution and Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will, though Shaw modified it.
Because Schopenhauer was a bit too pessimistic for him.
Exactly. Schopenhauer saw the will as blind and governed by chance, whereas Shaw saw the life force as deeply purposeful.
And this naturally leads to the concept of the Superman, which is famously associated with the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Right.
Now, Nietzsche conceived of the Superman in a deeply anti-Christian moral framework, pronouncing the death of God and envisioning a superior being who achieves greatness by virtue of sheer strength and will, rejecting charity and compassion as effeminate weaknesses.
There is also an interesting literary coincidence here with Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky created Raskolnikov, a young man who decides to prove he's a Superman who can rise above ordinary human morality by murdering an old pawnbroker.
Though, of course, Dostoevsky resolves that story by having Raskolnikov find redemption through Christian suffering, which is the exact opposite of Nietzsche.
Let me push back on this, because hearing the words Superman and willed evolution in the early 20th century sounds dangerously close to eugenics or brutal authoritarianism. Did Shaw actually buy into Nietzsche's vision of a strong man ruling the weak?
It's a vital question, and the answer is a definitive no. Shaw completely rejected Nietzsche's anti-Christian, brute strength male chauvinism. While Shaw considered himself a perfect Wagnerite, meaning he deeply admired the composer Richard Wagner, who also celebrated heroes of exceptional primal strength, Shaw could not stomach Nietzsche's philosophy.
For Shaw, the life force is not driving humanity toward a guy who can bench press a horse or conquer a neighboring country by military force.
So what is Shaw's life force driving toward?
Superior intelligence. For Shaw, the ultimate goal of human evolution is the expansion of the mind. The Superman is a philosopher, a thinker who can see through illusions and organize society rationally.
It's wild to think about all these heavy, world-altering philosophies swirling around in his head.
Yeah.
And some of his intensely analytical, almost anti-emotional roots go right back to his bizarre upbringing.
Oh, his childhood was a mess.
He was born in Dublin in 1856 to an impoverished Protestant family. His father, George Carr Shaw, was a severe alcoholic,
which had a profound psychological impact on him. His father's drunkenness was financially disastrous for the family and created in the young Shaw a strong, visceral revulsion for alcohol, contributing to his lifelong Puritanism and strict teetotalism.
He learned very early to despise the loss of intellectual control.
And then there's his mother, Lucinda Elizabeth, and this music teacher named George John Vandeleur Lee. They formed this bizarre ménage à trois.
Wait, so his mom's music teacher just lived with them and his alcoholic dad, and they all just functioned as a unit?
Exactly. Lee essentially moved in with the family. Both Lee and Mrs. Shaw earned their living from music, teaching, and performing. It was highly unconventional for Victorian Dublin.
That's putting it mildly.
The result was that Shaw was immersed in classical music from childhood. He learned to appreciate the structure, rhythm, and interplay of voices in opera and symphony, which would massively influence how he later wrote dialogue.
He hated Dublin, right?
He was miserable there and eventually moved to London in his 20s to join his mother and sister. And for years, he failed miserably. He wrote 5 complete novels, titles like Immaturity and The Irrational Knot, that were universally rejected by publishers.
He survived by becoming a brilliant, notoriously sharp professional reviewer and critic of music and drama for various magazines. This gave him a meager economic support, but more importantly, a platform for expressing his ideas and analyzing exactly what was wrong with the London stage.
And then he finally started writing plays himself. Let's walk through the phases of his playwriting career, because the evolution is staggering and provides the exact context we need for Pygmalion.
He began with what he categorized as the unpleasant plays. These included Widowers' Houses, The Philanderer, and Mrs. Warren's Profession. They were grim, bitter, discussion-heavy plays meant to force the audience to confront the ugly economic realities of society, specifically slum landlordism and organized prostitution.
What's fascinating about these early plays is his dialectical approach. Even as a devoted Fabian socialist who clearly took the side of the poor, he refused to write cheap melodrama.
They didn't just make the rich guys cartoon villains.
Right. He allowed the wrong side to make a fair, highly articulate, totally logical argument. That is the hallmark of Shavian drama.
Can you give an example of that?
For instance, in Widowers' Houses, Sartorius is a ruthless slum landlord. But Shaw gives him the space to logically justify himself, pointing out that the respectable middle-class investors are the ones actually funding him.
Oof.
And in Mrs. Warren's Profession, Mrs. Warren deeply moves her highly educated daughter by explaining the brutal economic realities and lack of options for working-class women that forced her into prostitution as a means of survival.
But the English audiences found them way too grim. They weren't critical or financial successes. So Shaw pivots. He realizes that to get his medicine down, he has to coat it in sugar.
He writes the pleasant plays and the plays for Puritans. This is where he discovers his comic genius. Plays like You Never Can Tell, Candida, and Arms and the Man. He starts actively attacking romantic tropes using comedy.
Arms and the Man is a perfect example. It's a famous anti-romantic comedy that destroys the illusions of romantic warfare. The heroine is obsessed with a cavalry officer who led a glorious suicidal charge.
But she meets a pragmatic, professional Swiss mercenary who tells her the reality cavalry charges are stupid, and an experienced soldier carries chocolate into battle, not extra cartridges, because food keeps you alive.
He also introduces a recurring character dynamic in these plays, a triangle where a woman has to choose between a rational, practical thinker and a sentimental, idealistic poet. We see this in Candida.
It's basically Shaw's response to Ibsen's A Doll's House.
Exactly. But instead of the wife slamming the door and leaving to find herself, Candida chooses to stay with her Christian socialist husband because she realizes he is actually weaker and needs her more than the young romantic poet does.
And in Caesar and Cleopatra, his first major historical venture, he completely subverts both Shakespeare and Dryden. Shaw's Julius Caesar is not a tragic hero or a doomed romantic.
He's much more practical.
He is a hard-headed, highly practical, down-to-earth administrator who refuses to be swayed by romantic notions like love or revenge. He mentors Cleopatra on how to rule practically.
And then he enters his era of absolute undisputed masterpieces. Let's talk about Man and Superman, written in 1903. This is the ultimate life force play.
You have Anne Whitefield, who represents the mother woman, and John Tanner, who represents the philosopher.
And the twist is that the woman chases the man. She ruthlessly pursues the philosopher because her biological instinct, driven by the life force, knows he is the best genetic match to breed the Superman.
It's a brilliant inversion of the traditional romantic chase. And it includes the famous Don Juan in Hell dream sequence in Act 3, which is basically a 90-minute philosophical debate between the devil Don Juan and a statue, marking a clear departure from the strict conventions of Ibsenite realism.
Next is Major Barbara in 1905, another brilliantly anti-romantic play. You have Andrew Undershaft, a hyper-practical multi-millionaire armament manufacturer who makes weapons of mass destruction, and his daughter Barbara, an idealistic major in the Salvation Army trying to save souls.
You'd naturally assume the play is about the good Christian daughter converting her evil capitalist father to a life of peace.
But no, Shaw subverts it entirely. The capitalist father systematically proves to the daughter that her Salvation Army is funded by the very whiskey distillers and weapon makers she despises.
He converts her and her poet fiancé.
The Shavian solution presented is that poverty is the ultimate crime, and the enlightened, sensitive intellectual must acquire real power, economic and political power, through practical means if they ever actually want to solve the world's problems.
Then there's Heartbreak House, written over 6 years during the absolute devastation of World War I. He subtitles it a fantasia in the Russian manner on English themes.
It is heavily Chekhovian, focusing on creating mood and atmosphere over plot, with people behaving strangely in a country house.
But he uses Shakespearean parallels, evoking the madness of King Lear and the jealousy of Othello.
The house itself symbolizes England, drifting aimlessly without leadership or will. It's populated by an enlightened but effete, useless aristocracy, the heartbreakers, and crude, uncultured business magnates.
And it ends, quite literally, with German Zeppelins dropping bombs from the sky on this decadent society, a chilling vision of mass destruction if the upper class doesn't wake up to reality.
And he just kept swinging for the fences, getting more and more ambitious. He wrote Back to Methuselah, which is a 5-part, multi-night epic taking us from the Garden of Eden all the way to 30,000 years in the future.
It's his ultimate demonstration of creative evolution, depicting a future where humans hatch fully formed from giant eggs and eventually evolve to exist as disembodied minds of pure thought.
And finally, St. Joan in 1923, which explores nationalism, early feminism, and individual genius clashing with centralized institutional authority. He even includes a time-bending epilogue proving the world is never truly ready to accept its saints.
This exhaustive, incredibly diverse output proves Shaw's immense vitality. Through sheer force of will, intellect, and volume, he became a towering public figure, recognized globally.
So what does this massive philosophical and theatrical background mean for his 1912 masterpiece, Pygmalion? How does all of this connect? Because all of these obsessions, intellect, class warfare, social mobility, anti-romanticism, feminism, the life force, they perfectly crystallize in Pygmalion.
But to understand it, we have to realize that ostensibly, on its surface, this is a play about vowels.
Yes, the politics of phonetics. It seems like a niche subject, but for Shaw, it was the key to everything. In his preface to the play, Shaw states bluntly that the English have no respect for their language and will not teach their children to speak it properly.
He believed that accents were the ultimate impenetrable class barrier in British society. As he wrote, "It is impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him."
Enter Professor Henry Higgins. He is partly based on a real phonetician of the time named Henry Sweet. Higgins is basically wizard of speech.
In Act 1, he's taking notes under the portico of St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden during a rainstorm.
People think he's a police informant, but he reveals he can place any man within 6 miles, sometimes within 2 streets of London, purely by listening to his accent.
He is a linguistic Sherlock Holmes, but Higgins is also completely ruthless and devoid of standard empathy. When he hears the impoverished flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, crying out in her thick Cockney accent, he doesn't feel pity.
He tells her that a woman uttering such depressing and disgusting sounds has no right to live.
He views her native language as the sacred language of Shakespeare, Milton, and the Bible, and berates her for sitting there crooning like a bilious pigeon.
The entire plot is Higgins' scientific experiment. He makes a bet with his colleague, Colonel Pickering, that he can take this draggle-tailed gutter snipe, his words, not mine, and pass her off as a duchess at an ambassador's garden party in 6 months, simply by changing her speech and teaching her upper-class manners.
He wants to prove that he can artificially fill the deepest gulf that separates class from class.
But Shaw doesn't just use this setup to mock the wealthy elites. He uses it to launch a multifaceted critique of snobbery in all directions. He shows that the working class is just as susceptible to the illusions of status.
Oh, totally. The moment Eliza gets a little bit of money from Higgins to take a cab home, she insists on taking the taxi, but she tells the driver to let her out of the corner and wait.
Why?
Purely so she can make her old friends in the slums jealous by being seen stepping out of a cab. Later in the play, Higgins actually has to reprimand her and tell her not to cut her old friends now that she's risen in the world, explicitly calling out her newfound snobbery.
And then there is Shaw's brilliant critique of what was known as genteel poverty, portrayed through the Eynsford Hill family. Mrs. Eynsford Hill has the manners, the accent, and the habits of a fine lady, but she entirely lacks a fine lady's income.
Which traps them. It's a completely paralyzing situation. I remember reading this and thinking, Why doesn't the son, Freddie, just go get a job at a bank or a shipping office?
Right. But the expert analysis points out that they can't because their class conventions explicitly forbid it. The daughter, Clara, can't get educated because they can't afford a proper school, and she can't mix with the working class without losing her status.
Freddie went to a cheap, pretentious school, knows a little Latin, but has zero practical skills. He literally doesn't know how a checking account works.
It is a systemic trap, and it perfectly echoes the central problem Eliza will face. By educating her to speak and act like a duchess, Higgins hasn't given her a practical vocational education.
When the 6-month experiment is over, she can't go back to selling flowers on the pavement in Covent Garden. Her new sensibilities would be repulsed by it, but she has no independent income to maintain her life as a fine lady. She rightly asks Higgins, "What am I fit for?"
But the absolute best, most hilarious comic reversal on class comes from Eliza's father, Alfred Doolittle. He is an eloquent dustman, a garbage collector who proudly declares himself one of the undeserving poor.
When he first shows up at Higgins's house, he's just trying to extort £5 from Higgins for taking his daughter.
And Higgins is so immensely amused by Doolittle's natural gift for rhetoric, his absolute lack of morals, and his philosophical defense of being undeserving, that he jokingly writes a letter to an American millionaire named Ezra D. Wannefeller, claiming that Doolittle is the most original moralist at present in England.
And in a massive twist of fate, the millionaire dies and leaves Doolittle a massive fortune, provided he lectures at the millionaire's moral reform societies.
But instead of being thrilled, Doolittle is miserable. He comes back in Act 5 wearing a top hat and a tailored suit, completely furious. Let me actually quote his speech because it's incredible.
Oh, please do.
He says to Higgins, who asked him to make a gentleman of me, "I was happy. I was free. I touched pretty nigh everybody for money when I wanted it, same as I touched you. Now I am worrited, tied neck and heels, and everybody touches me for money."
It is a profound, albeit highly comedic, subversion of the rags to riches dream. Doolittle brilliantly critiques what he calls middle-class morality.
He explains that his newfound respectability is a prison.
He has to work to maintain his status. Doctors suddenly find things wrong with him to charge him medical fees. And worst of all, middle-class morality dictates that he is forced to finally marry his live-in mistress of many years to make an honest woman of her.
It's exactly like someone who wins the lottery today. You constantly read these tragic stories where someone wins $100 million and suddenly their entire life is ruined.
They're sued by lawyers, distant relatives they haven't seen in 20 years show up begging for cash.
Right. They face massive tax complications, and they realize they were actually much happier when they were broke and anonymous. Middle-class morality claims its victim.
This exploration of class ties directly into Shaw's exploration of the true meaning of manners in the play. We see a stark, deliberate contrast between Higgins and Colonel Pickering.
Higgins treats Eliza and everyone else like dirt. He calls her a baggage, a gutter snipe, a squashed cabbage leaf. He swears constantly, he throws things, and he is generally careless about other people's feelings.
Whereas Pickering is the quintessential perfect gentleman. He calls her Miss Doolittle from day one. He stands up when she enters the room.
In Act 5, Eliza explicitly tells Higgins that it was Pickering who actually taught her nice manners, because Pickering consistently treated a flower girl like a duchess.
But Shaw refuses to let Pickering's conventional politeness be the final word. He gives Higgins a deeply philosophical retort that cuts to the core of Shaw's own beliefs.
Higgins defends himself by saying, "My manners are exactly the same as Colonel Pickering's. I treat a duchess as if she was a flower girl."
Yes, I highlighted that exact quote. The great secret, Eliza, is not having bad manners or good manners or any other particular sort of manners, but having the same manner for all human souls. In short, behaving as if you were in heaven, where there are no third-class carriages, and one soul is as good as another.
That is such a heavy, brilliant insight. The egalitarianism of being equally rude to everyone.
It strips away the artificiality of class-based politeness and demands a fundamental, unvarnished equality. Which brings us perfectly into the psychology of the play. Because this clash of manners and philosophies isn't just about class. It fuels one of the most debated, unconventional, and frustrating man-woman relationships in all of literature.
The Eliza and Higgins dynamic. Higgins is a confirmed, adamant bachelor, and Shaw is very explicit about why. Higgins isn't just focused on his work. He suffers from a massive Oedipus complex, a total mother fixation.
Yes, and Shaw makes this clear through Higgins's relationship with Mrs. Higgins. She is wealthy, highly intelligent, graceful, and possesses a deeply cultivated sense of art and fashion.
Higgins openly admits to his mother, "My idea of a lovable woman is something as like you as possible."
This sets an impossibly high standard that no young woman he meets can ever hope to meet, effectively disengaging his affections and idealism from his sexual impulses.
And the expert analysis in our sources connects this psychological profile directly to Shaw's own biography. We mentioned earlier that Shaw idolized his own mother, Lucinda Elizabeth, and her musical talents.
Furthermore, his marriage to Charlotte Payne Townsend, a wealthy woman who resembled his mother in many authoritative ways, was reportedly never consummated.
Shaw, much like Higgins, seemed to treat romance entirely as an intellectual exercise, largely avoiding normal, messy, emotional, and physical entanglement.
Which heavily influences exactly how Higgins treats Eliza. He doesn't view her as a romantic prospect. He sees her as a block of wood, a raw material for his scientific experiment.
He even admits to Pickering that he might as well be a block of wood himself when it comes to women. But Eliza is not a block of wood. She is highly sensitive, she has a soul, and she demands kindness and recognition for her hard work.
This fundamental disconnect boils over in the famous Act 4 scene. Eliza successfully passes as a duchess at the ambassador's garden party. She wins the bet for him. They come back to the laboratory.
And what do Higgins and Pickering do? They totally ignore her. They sit around drinking, talking about how incredibly glad they are the experiment is finally over, how boring it got toward the end, and thanking God it's done.
And Eliza's sitting right there. She is so deeply hurt by this profound indifference that she explodes. She throws his slippers directly at his face and tries to physically scratch his eyes out.
In that moment, Eliza fully realizes that to him, she is merely a tool, a monument to his own genius. But the power equation fundamentally changes here.
By educating her, he has given her a better status, and she refuses to let go of her new position of strength. She states clearly, "I won't be passed over."
When Higgins, entirely out of his depth emotionally, awkwardly admits he has grown accustomed to her voice and appearance, she coldly tells him to turn on his gramophone cylinders if he misses her.
It's the ultimate anti-romantic choice. Audiences, directors, and even the original actors themselves beg Shaw to let Eliza and Higgins marry at the end of the play. It's what the fairy tale demands.
But Shaw vehemently refused. He insisted they do not end up together. He even went so far as to write a prose epilogue explaining exactly why Eliza marries the weak, useless Freddie Eynsford Hill instead.
Which brings up a very common critique from readers. Many ask why the brilliant, newly empowered, strong-willed Eliza would choose Freddie.
As we noted, Freddie has no practical skills. He writes her love letters 3 times a day, but he can't even run a flower shop without Pickering stepping in to explain how a checking account works.
Exactly. I have to ask, isn't Freddie a complete downgrade? Why on earth would the brilliant Eliza, who just stood toe-to-toe with a genius like Higgins, choose a guy who is effectively useless?
If we look closely at Shaw's overarching philosophy of the life force, it makes perfect sense. Shaw is actively shattering the romantic illusion that women want to be mastered, dominated, or bullied by a strong man.
Eliza is strong. She represents the life force moving forward. Shaw argues that the man or woman who feels strong enough for two seeks for every other quality in a partner than strength.
Wait, so she specifically wants someone she can dominate?
Precisely. She doesn't want a godlike tyrant telling her what to do. As Shaw puts it in the epilogue, Galatea never does quite like Pygmalion. His relation to her is too godlike to be altogether agreeable.
Eliza refuses to be a doormat for a genius.
By marrying Freddie, a man who utterly adores her and whom she can control and guide, she secures her independence and equality in a way she never could with the domineering older Higgins. In this context, she is the ultimate feminist fighter. She chooses agency over romance.
Man, that completely changes how you view the ending. It's not a tragedy that she doesn't get Higgins, it's a triumph that she escapes him. But to tell a story that subverts so many ingrained romantic and class expectations, Shaw had to completely hack the traditional dramatic structure.
He did. The structural mechanics of the play are fascinating in how they manipulate the audience. As we mentioned, the title explicitly parallels the Roman poet Ovid's myth from Metamorphoses, where Pygmalion, the king of Cyprus, sculpts an ivory statue of a woman so beautiful he falls desperately in love with her.
Aphrodite breathes life into the statue, Galatea, and they live happily ever after.
But Shaw takes that mythological blueprint and deliberately twists the ending. The creator makes the creation, he breathes life into her via phonetics, but they absolutely do not live happily ever after.
To frame this subversion, Shaw uses a meticulous five-act structure, which was common from the Renaissance to the Romantic period, but he applies it with incredible symmetry.
The scenery alternates beautifully to contrast the public and private spheres. Act 1 is outside in a public space, Covent Garden. Act 2 moves indoors to Higgins's private laboratory on Wimpole Street.
Act 3 moves to a semi-public social space, Mrs. Higgins's drawing room in Chelsea. Act 4 is back to the private laboratory, and Act 5 returns to the Chelsea drawing room.
It constantly forces Higgins's private clinical phonetic experiment to interact with the larger, messy social world. And the character pairings within that structure are so deliberate.
You have the two mothers, the ineffective Mrs. Eynsford Hill, who can't guide her children, contrasted with the formidable Mrs. Higgins, who sees right through her son's nonsense.
You have the two suitors, the domineering, intellectual Higgins versus the weak, adoring Freddie, and the two phoneticians, the rude, brilliant Higgins versus the polite, gentlemanly Pickering.
There is also brilliant structural economy at play. For instance, consider the missing character. Alfred Doolittle constantly mentions Eliza's stepmother, his living mistress, who is supposedly a terror.
But Shaw brilliantly keeps her entirely off stage for the entire play. Including her would have bloated the plot and distracted from Eliza, but referencing her constantly broadens the social world and adds mystery to Doolittle's background without costing a dime in staging.
He also deleted scenes for the stage version to maintain focus. In an earlier draft, there's an actual scene at the ambassador's garden party where we see Eliza actively passing as a duchess and fooling everyone.
But Shaw cut it from the final stage version. He realized that watching Eliza successfully make polite small talk for 20 minutes was dramatically tedious.
The real drama isn't the party. The real drama is the aftermath, the emotional fallout in Act 4 when she realizes she has no future.
This structural subversion extends to how Shaw actively mingles genres to keep the audience off balance. He actually subtitles the play A Romance in 5 Acts, which is deeply ironic.
He uses classic elements of a Cinderella fairy tale, a magical transformation, an impoverished girl gaining fine clothes and attending a ball.
He even uses the pathetic fallacy in Act 1, where a blinding flash of lightning and a peal of thunder magically orchestrate Eliza and Freddie's very first coincidental collision in the rain.
It feels exactly like a fairy tale setup, but then he undercuts it with standard comedy tropes. We get classic comic reversals, like Doolittle's absolute misery at getting rich, or Higgins, the great bully, being bullied and outsmarted by his own creation.
He even takes the old theatrical trope of the comic foreigner, where a character is funny simply because of a foreign accent, and applies it to comic English accents, exposing the absurdity of how the English judge their own dialects.
And beyond genre mingling, Shaw introduces overtly novelistic elements into the dramatic form. If you read the script, his stage directions aren't just technical instructions like enter stage left.
They are long, essay-like character descriptions revealing internal thoughts and histories. When we first meet Higgins, Shaw writes a massive paragraph describing him as an impetuous baby who is void of malice and who bullies people with the pure innocence of a child.
Later, he even tells the reader that Higgins is hearing the voice of God rebuking him.
Which is insane from a production standpoint. You can't put that on stage. An actor can't act hearing the voice of God in the stage direction. And the biggest novelistic element is, of course, the epilogue we discuss.
Yes, the prose epilogue. Shaw literally had to append a massive prose essay to the end of the printed play to explicitly explain why Eliza marries Freddie.
He did this because the play's dramatic structure alone failed to convince the romantic public. They still desperately wanted her to marry Higgins, so Shaw stepped in, breaking the theatrical form entirely, acting as an omniscient novelist to force his philosophical ending upon the reader.
That is such a control freak move. Like, if you won't interpret my play the way I want, I will just write a 15-page essay telling you exactly what happens after the curtain drops.
Which brings us to our final major topic, the language, style, and legacy of Pygmalion. Ultimately, all this structure, psychology, and philosophy is delivered through Shaw's incredibly deliberate, almost musical use of language on the page.
Shaw was famously dismissive of literary style for its own sake. He claimed he never aimed at style, only accuracy, stating, "If a writer says what he has to say as accurately and effectively as he can, his style will take care of itself."
But he was an absolute master of what he called effectiveness of assertion.
I love the analogy the academic text uses, comparing Shaw's dialogue to a boxing match. It is constant denials, deflections, and counterpunches. The analysis points out this massive pattern of negation.
If you look at the very first page of the play, it's just people saying, no, not so long, won't get no cab, not until, can't stand here. He structures his arguments by constantly confronting and denying the opposition.
Furthermore, he heavily manipulated spelling and grammar on the page to force the actors to mimic the socioeconomic realities of London. To represent Eliza's initial dialect, he spells out sounds phonetically.
For instance, instead of "will you pay me for them," he writes it as "will you pie me for them."
He reproduced terrible grammar to capture class distinctions, like Eliza using triple negatives. "You won't get no cab not until 11:30, or "I don't want to have no truck with him."
Let me just react to that, because hearing you say "will you pie me for them" out loud highlights how ridiculous and specific it is. That sounds absolutely exhausting for an actor to parse on the page, but it forces them out of their comfortable stage school articulation and into the muddy reality of the streets.
He even messed with typography, right? He would literally space out the letters in a word to indicate vocal emphasis. When Higgins is shocked by his housekeeper complaining about his swearing, the text visually stretches out his specific words to force the actor to elongate the vowels.
This obsessive attention to detail.
Pickering, in sharp contrast, speaks in polite, indirect, convoluted sentences. He says things like, "May I ask, sir, do you do this for your living at A?"
And Eliza is colorful and repetitive. She constantly asserts her dignity with the refrain, "I'm a good girl, I am." And she uses amazing slang, like saying, "whoever stole her aunt's hat, done her in," which shocks the high society ladies who think it's the new fashion in small talk.
And then you have Doolittle, who has this conic, didactic, bravura rhetoric, delivering massive, eloquent, perfectly structured speeches about middle-class morality, despite having no formal education.
Shaw also peppers the text with high art allusions to enrich the texture and sometimes deflate his character's pretensions. Higgins quotes Milton's phrase, "native wood notes wild," to describe Eliza's horrific squawking. Pickering references Beethoven and Brahms.
Shaw even references Dickens and subtly parodies Shakespeare's description of Cleopatra to describe the author H.G. Wells in the epilogue. It's an incredibly dense linguistic tapestry designed to reward careful listening.
Which brings us to the legacy of the play. It had a modest success initially, but then came the cinema. The 1938 film adaptation starred Leslie Howard as Higgins and Wendy Hiller as Eliza. Shaw actually wrote the screenplay for it himself, protecting his vision, and he won an Academy Award for it.
But the ultimate staggering irony of Shaw's legacy lies in the musical adaptation. When the composer Franz Lehár proposed a musical version of Pygmalion during Shaw's lifetime, Shaw firmly, angrily refused.
In 1948, he explicitly wrote, "I absolutely forbid any such outrage." He hated the idea of his anti-romantic, highly intellectual, dialectical play being turned into a sentimental sing-along.
But then Shaw dies in 1950. And what happens just 6 years later? My Fair Lady opens on Broadway in 1956, starring Rex Harrison as Higgins and Julie Andrews as Eliza, and later famously adapted into the film with Audrey Hepburn.
It has soaring romantic songs like "Wouldn't It Be Loverly" and "I Could Have Danced All Night." It becomes an astonishing, monstrous global hit.
It ran for thousands of performances. It won multiple Oscars. It made Shaw's estate posthumously incredibly wealthy from the very thing he despised and explicitly forbade.
The creators of the musical softened Higgins, romanticized the ending to heavily imply they end up together, and gave the audience the exact fairy tale Shaw had spent his entire life trying to dismantle.
That is just wild. Okay, let's pull all of this together. We've been on an epic journey today. We started in the candlelit and closed stages of the 1660 Restoration with its witty, cynical comedies of manners and grand heroic tragedies.
We suffered through the barren 18th century where moralizing tracts killed the comedy, and the Victorian melodramas where poets failed to write actable dialogue.
We witnessed the realistic revolution of Ibsen, who used the late point of attack to expose middle-class secrets, and Chekhov, who made dialogue messy and real. This set the perfect stage for Shaw's unique blend of Fabian socialism, creative evolution, and his life force philosophy.
And we saw how he channeled all of that massive intellectual weight into Pygmalion, a play that uses the microscopic science of speech to expose the absolute absurdity of class barriers, the terrifying trap of middle-class morality, and the foolishness of romantic tropes.
He created an Oedipal, bullying Pygmalion in Higgins, and a feminist, life force-driven Galatea in Eliza, who throws slippers, demands independence, and chooses a weak man she can control over a genius who views her as a block of wood.
He twisted traditional dramatic structure, bent fairy tale genres, and weaponized language through negations and phonetics to force his audience to think critically rather than just feel sentimentally.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Think about the ultimate irony of Shaw's life and work. Here is a man who was utterly obsessed with control. He wanted to control human evolution itself through the life force.
He tried to control his actors and readers through insanely detailed novelistic stage directions.
He literally tried to control the English language by rewriting spelling and grammar. He even wrote a prose epilogue to force his audiences to accept his unromantic ending.
Yet, the very moment he died, his control vanished entirely.
Exactly. His work was hijacked, romanticized, and set to music in My Fair Lady by the exact cultural forces he spent his life analyzing and criticizing. The public wanted the fairy tale, and they took it.
It leaves us with a fascinating, almost haunting question. Does a creator ever truly own their art once it's spoken aloud?
Or does the world inevitably shape the story into the myth it wants to hear, no matter how hard the author fights back?
A profound question about the nature of art, authorship, and audience desire.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the stories you're told, the manners you accept, and of course, the words you use every day. Until next time.